Number 10 sits just beyond the walls of classical Athens, a jagged fissure in the rocky ground of the Hill of the Nymphs, and it goes by the name Barathron. Picture the scene. The wall of the city rises above you sun-bleached and streaked with the salt of the coast. The road leading out of the Melittides Gate is dusty, worn by centuries of foot traffic. Somewhere near the northwest corner of the hill, the earth simply opens. A crack in the limestone drops down into darkness. And around the edge of that crack, when Athens was at the height of its power, lay a scatter of things you never want to see. Bones, rags of clothing, sometimes bodies that had not yet finished dying. This is where the democracy of Pericles disposed of its condemned. This is where the men whose crimes offended the polis were dragged, still breathing, and thrown in. In the 5th century BC, the Athenians preferred not to spill blood with their own hands. Hemlock was reserved for citizens of standing men like Socrates, who could be trusted to drink their poison with philosophical dignity. But for traitors, for temple robbers, for those who had defiled the sacred rites, and above all for foreign envoys the Athenians decided had no business breathing their air, the Barathron waited. It was a chasm, a pit, and eyewitness accounts describe it as fitted with iron hooks embedded in its walls, hooks designed to catch the fallen body on its way down to slow the descent, to prolong the agony. Xenophon, the Athenian historian, mentions it in his Hellenica when he describes the vicious politics of the trial of the generals after the naval battle at Arginus. Plato references it. Herodotus records the moment when Spartan envoys, sent to negotiate with Athens, were hurled into it without so much as a hearing. What kind of state throws diplomats down a hole? A state that has decided their existence is an offense against the gods. The Athenians justified the practice by insisting that the men and women who died in the Barathron were not really executed. They had simply been cast out, removed. The gods, not the citizens, would decide their fate. If they died on impact, that was the will of Athena. If they lay broken and screaming at the bottom for 3 days, that was also the will of Athena. This was the exquisite hypocrisy of democratic justice. Hands stayed clean, consciences stayed clear, and the corpses rotted in open air visible from the roads outside the walls, a smell that residents of the surrounding demes learned to endure like the smell of the tanneries. Modern topographers rediscovered the probable location of the Barathron in the early 20th century, tracing the ancient references and mapping the road that once led out to it. What they found was a shallower cleft than the ancient sources implied, worn down by 2,500 years of erosion and later burial. But the horror of the place is not measured in meters. It is measured in the length of time an untreated broken body can survive without water, without food, and without anyone willing to reach a hand down to help. Days, in most cases, sometimes longer. And here is the detail that ancient historians recorded almost casually, as if it were unremarkable. The bodies were not always removed. Some were left as a warning. Athenian children who wandered too close to the walls learned early what the Barathron was, and what it meant to hear a groan rising from the crack in the earth beyond the road. The forgetting began before the victim was even dead. Number 9 takes us upriver on the Nile, deep into the frontier lands of ancient Nubia, to a fortress built in stone the color of dried blood at the Second Cataract, where the river narrows and boils over jagged black rocks. The place is called Semna, and it was constructed during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, roughly 1850 BC, under the reign of Pharaoh Senesret III. The Egyptians did not build Semna as a prison in the way we would understand the word. They built it as a border post, a customs house, and a military garrison designed to control the movement of Nubians into Egyptian territory. But border posts, in the ancient world, doubled as terminal facilities for a particular category of person, the person you did not want to kill outright, but also did not want to see again. The Semna Dispatches, a collection of papyri discovered in the 20th century and now held in the British Museum, offer a chillingly bureaucratic glimpse of how this system worked. Written in careful hieratic script by scribes stationed at the fortress, the dispatches record the daily movements of Nubian traders, the arrival of patrols, the observation of unauthorized crossings, and the disposition of individuals sent south for reasons the papyri do not explain. What the dispatches do not record, notably, is the return of these individuals. Names cross the border in one direction. They do not come back. Egyptian legal practice under the Middle Kingdom did not include formal imprisonment as a punishment. If you committed a serious crime, you were beaten, mutilated, sent to the mines, or executed. But there existed a specific category of state prisoner, often political, often military, often the wrong kind of noble at the wrong moment in a succession dispute, whose fate was handled with a kind of deliberate ambiguity. These men were assigned to service at the frontier fortresses. Their families were not informed of their destination, their names were removed from the tax rolls, from the temple registers, from the state records that tracked who existed in Egypt. In the harsh administrative language of the Middle Kingdom, they simply stopped being. At Semna, and at the other fortresses in the Second Cataract chain, Buhen, Kumma, Urinardi, Mergissa, these forgotten men served as garrison labor, as porters, as construction workers on walls that were constantly being repaired against Nubian incursions. They ate what the soldiers ate, when there was food. They slept where they could, when there was shelter. And they died in a climate that was and remains one of the most punishing on Earth. Summer temperatures at the Second Cataract regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. There is no water except what the Nile provides, and during the annual retreat of the flood, even that could dwindle to a trickle. Disease was endemic: bilharzia, sandfly fever, dysentery, guinea worm. Excavations at Mergissa in the 1960s uncovered mass graves near the fortress walls, hastily dug pits containing skeletons showing signs of violent death, malnutrition, and no evidence of embalming. This mattered. In Egyptian belief, a body that was not properly prepared for burial could not enter the afterlife. To die at Semna and be dumped in a sandpit was not merely to die, it was to be annihilated. Your name was gone, your family did not know you were dead, your soul had nowhere to go. You had been unmade in every possible sense. The papyri record none of this directly, of course. Bureaucrats do not write down the atrocities their bureaucracy enables. But when historians match the surviving dispatches against the archaeological record, a pattern emerges. The men sent to Semna vanished. The fortress ate them. And the state of Egypt, methodical and efficient in its record keeping, simply stopped mentioning that they had ever existed at all. Number 8 takes us into the interior of a palace, which is a very different kind of prison from a border fort, but one whose walls became just as impossible to escape. The place is Shaqiu Palace, a hunting lodge in the flat sandy country of what is now Hebei province in northeastern China. In the years 295 BC, the prisoner is not a criminal, not a traitor, not a foreign king. He is Zhao Yong, better known to history as King Wuling of Zhao, and until 4 years earlier, he had been one of the most powerful rulers of the Warring States period. King Wuling had transformed the Zhao state through his famous reforms, adopting nomadic-style clothing and horse archery from the northern peoples, building the Zhao Great Wall, and turning a middling regional power into a military force that could challenge the emerging Qin. He was, by every measure, a great man. And in 299 BC, in a decision that historians have argued about for 2,300 years, he abdicated the throne in favor of his younger son, Zhao He, who became King Huiwen. Wuling took for himself the title of Zhufu, the Lord Father, and retreated from active governance to focus on military campaigns and personal cultivation. It was a mistake. His older son, Zhao Zhang, the son who had been passed over, could not swallow the humiliation of bowing to his younger brother at court. Wuling, seeing the pain on his older son's face, began to consider dividing the state, giving Zhang the northern territories, allowing him to also style himself a king. The plan leaked. In 295 BC, during a joint hunting expedition at Shaqiu, Zhang launched a preemptive strike against his brother, killed one of the king's ministers, and then fled to his father's palace for protection. Wuling, sentimental to the last, took him in. The forces loyal to King Huiwen surrounded the palace. They were commanded by Lord Cheng and by Li Yu ministers who understood exactly what would happen to them if Wuling ever regained influence. They killed Zhao Zhang. And then they made a decision that has echoed through Chinese history ever since. They ordered every member of the palace staff to leave. Servants, cooks, guards, gardeners, everyone. They locked the gates behind them. And they left the Lord Father, the aging former king, the reformer who had built Zhao into a great power, alone inside his own palace. No food, no water, no communication with the outside world. Wuling was 60 years old. The palace was well appointed, but it was a hunting lodge stocked with silks and hangings and lacquered furniture, not with grain. Within days, he had exhausted whatever food remained in the kitchens. He walked through his empty halls in a growing daze of hunger, searching for anything edible. The records of the grand historian, Sima Qian's monumental history, compiled some 200 years later, preserves the detail that has haunted every Chinese schoolchild who has ever heard the story. Wuling climbed to the eaves of the palace and began pulling down sparrow nests. He ate the fledglings, he ate the eggs, he caught grown birds when he could. This continued for more than 3 months. When the besieging forces finally opened the gates, they found the Lord Father's body already decomposed, the palace empty of even the smallest bird, the eaves stripped bare. The son who had ordered the siege, Hing Huiwen, never publicly acknowledged responsibility. The ministers who had actually enforced the isolation, Lord Cheng and Li Yu, escaped punishment. The state of Zhao carried on. But the reformer, the visionary, the man who had reshaped a nation, had ended his life by starving to death alone in a room forgotten so completely by his own family that they did not even open the door to check whether he was still alive. Sima Qian, writing about the incident, does not moralize. He simply records it. And in the recording, he ensures that the forgetting Wuling suffered would not be the final word. But the palace itself, the physical building at Shaqiu, was never used again as a royal residence. Something about it, perhaps only superstition, made it unbearable to inhabit. It sat abandoned in the sand for centuries, and only a low mound now marks the spot where a king ate baby birds to stay alive until he could not. Number 7 stands within the walls of a city that considered itself the center of the Christian world. And it was operational for so long that 5 emperors of the Byzantine Empire either passed through it or died within its foundations. The place is called the Prison of Anemas, and it is built into the northern land walls of Constantinople in the district of Barathron, where the Golden Horn curves inland and the palace of the emperors once looked out over the water. The prison takes its name from Michael Anemas, a Byzantine general who led an unsuccessful revolt against Emperor Alexios I Komnenos in the early 12th century, and became, according to tradition, the first prisoner held in its lower chambers. The structure itself is extraordinary. Its outer wall rises as high as 23 meters above the ground outside the city and is between 11 and 20 meters thick in places. Behind that outer wall lies a complex of 14 vaulted brick-lined dungeons connected by narrow passages, each one designed to hold a single high-status prisoner in complete isolation. There are no windows in the dungeons themselves. The only light comes from oil lamps carried in by guards, and the only air comes from small ventilation shafts that also serve to carry down the sounds of the city above, muffled and distorted. A constant reminder that life continues outside walls the prisoner will never leave. What made the prison of Anemas particularly terrible was its purpose. This was not a facility for common criminals. This was a facility for the men who had once ruled the empire. Emperors, generals, ministers of state, the intimate rivals and blood relatives of the ruling dynasty. In a political culture where blinding a rival was considered mercy because it removed him from the possibility of ever wearing the imperial diadem again, the prison of Anemas offered something more comprehensive. It offered Oblivion. The most famous inmate was Emperor Isaac II Angelos, who reigned from 1185 until 1195, when his own older brother, Alexios, marched with an army into the Balkans while Isaac was away on a hunting expedition and had himself proclaimed emperor by the troops. Isaac was captured, brought back to Constantinople, and had his eyes burned out with a hot iron. Then he was thrown into the prison of Anemas, along with his young son, also named Alexios. Isaac stayed there for 8 years. 8 years in darkness. 8 years listening to the muffled sounds of a city that was slowly forgetting it had once obeyed his commands. 8 years being fed just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive, in a dungeon that had been engineered to erode the human spirit through the simple technology of stone and silence. His body wasted, his mind unraveled. When the Fourth Crusade arrived at the walls of Constantinople in 1203, and his usurping brother fled the city in panic, the mob broke into the prison of Anemas and physically dragged the blind, half-mad Isaac out of his cell to put him back on the throne. He lived for less than a year afterward. His body had been broken so thoroughly by 8 years of confinement that he could not function as a ruler, and he died in early 1204. Other emperors met similar fates within its walls. Andronikos I. Komnenos. The aging tyrant torn apart by a Constantinople mob in 1185 spent his final hours in the prison being tortured by the men who had captured him. John IV. Lascaris. The boy emperor, blinded on his 11th birthday by his regent Michael VIII, Palaiologos, was held for years in the prison's isolation. The 12th century historian Anakomnene, daughter of the emperor who first used the prison as a state facility, wrote about Michael Anemas himself with pity, noting the humiliation of a proud general reduced to weeping and begging for release. The prison of Anemas still stands. You can walk to it today if you know where to look in modern Istanbul. The 14 dungeons are still there, buried beneath the earth of centuries. Some of them are open to visitors. And when you stand inside one, in the utter darkness, and the guide switches off the electric light for a moment so you can experience what it was like, you understand something that no history book can convey. You understand that the point of the place was not just to hold a body, it was to unmake a soul. Number 6 lies at the foot of the Capitoline Hill in the very heart of Rome. No more than a few hundred meters from the forum where senators debated the fate of empires, and it is arguably the most famous prison in the ancient world. The Romans called it the Tullianum. Later ages would call it the Mamertine prison. And the historian Sallust, writing in the 1st century BC, described it in a single sentence that has clung to the place for 2,000 years. Foul from neglect, darkness, and stench. He wrote, "It is an altogether terrifying sight." The Tullianum was originally a cistern, a subterranean chamber built to collect water from a spring that still seeps up from the floor of its lowest level. But by the time of the Roman Republic, it had been repurposed into something far grimmer. It is a 2-level structure. The upper chamber, called the carcer, is a small vaulted room reached by a short flight of stairs. The lower chamber, the Tullianum itself, sits about 3.5 meters below the ground level of the carcer, and in the Republican period, it could be entered only through a circular hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were not walked into the Tullianum, they were lowered through the hole by rope or simply dropped. The Romans, unlike the Greeks, did not use imprisonment as a punishment. Roman law was very clear on this point. Prison was not a sentence. It was a waiting room for execution, and the waiting could be brief, or it could stretch out into unbearable years depending entirely on the political theater surrounding a particular prisoner. Consider the case of Jugurtha, king of Numidia, who fought Rome to a standstill through the 110s BC before being captured through the treachery of his father-in-law. In 104 BC, Jugurtha was paraded through the streets of Rome in the triumph of Gaius Marius. Roman crowds spat on him. They stripped him of his royal robes. According to Plutarch, they even tore his gold earring from his ear, ripping the flesh of his earlobe. Then he was thrown into the Tullianum. Some accounts say he was strangled there. Others insist he was left to starve. Plutarch preserves what may be the most horrifying detail. As Jugurtha was lowered naked into the pit, he laughed and said, "Hercules, how cold your bath is." He starved to death in that darkness within a matter of days. Now consider a different case. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who nearly broke Julius Caesar at the siege of Alesia in 52 billion C, surrendered himself to Caesar in an act of theatrical self-sacrifice to spare his people. Caesar did not execute him. Caesar did not release him. Caesar kept him alive. For 6 years, Vercingetorix sat in the Tullianum, waiting. He was not tortured. He was not interrogated. He was simply held in the darkness at the bottom of a stone hole while Caesar completed the political maneuvering that would culminate in his crossing of the Rubicon and his eventual dictatorship. In 46 BC, Caesar finally celebrated his Gallic triumph. Vercingetorix was hauled out of the Tullianum, paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, and then lowered back into the pit and strangled. He had spent 6 years in that cell, forgetting what the sun looked like, watching his hair turn gray, listening to the forum breathe above him. The list of men who died in the Tullianum reads like an index of the losers of Roman politics. Simon Bar Giora, the leader of the Jewish revolt, was executed there after Titus's triumph in 70 AD. Sejanus, the fallen minister of Tiberius, was strangled there. The Catilinarian conspirators of 63 BC were strangled there on the personal orders of Cicero. The bodies were dropped into a drain that ran to the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, and washed out into the Tiber. A prisoner in the Tullianum did not simply die. He was flushed away as if he had never existed. And the Romans considered this appropriate, because in Roman legal theory, the men held in the Tullianum had ceased to be men. They had become the state's problem, and the state had its own tidy methods for solving problems that could not be allowed to persist. Number 5 takes us east, again, this time to the Persian plateau, and to a fortress whose very name was designed to make you forget it. The Middle Persian word is Anoshbord. The Armenian sources render it as bird Anush. English translations call it the Castle of Oblivion, or the Prison of Oblivion, or the Fortress of the Forgotten. The location is somewhere in the province of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran, though its exact site has never been definitively identified. And that, in a sense, was the entire point of the place. If you did not know where it was, you could not know who was inside it. And if you did not know who was inside it, you could not remember them. The Castle of Oblivion was operated by the Sasanian Empire, which ruled Persia from 224 AD until the Arab conquest in the 7th century, though there is evidence that a similar institution existed under the earlier Parthians. It was reserved for a specific category of prisoner, not common criminals, not military captives, but high-status political detainees, deposed kings, rebellious nobles, foreign monarchs, and men whose continued existence was politically inconvenient, but whose outright execution would provoke war. The genius of the place lay in its administrative structure. According to the Buzandaran Patmuchinka, an Armenian historical text from the 5th century, and confirmed by the Byzantine historian Procopius, in his work on the Persian Wars, it was forbidden by explicit imperial decree to speak the name of any prisoner held in the Castle of Oblivion. It was forbidden even to ask after them. To inquire about a prisoner was itself considered a form of treason. The name Anush, which the Armenians later interpreted as meaning oblivion or forgotten, may originally have derived from the Middle Persian word for immortal, or everlasting, referring to the permanence of the confinement rather than the erasure of memory. But the semantic drift is telling. Whenever the fortress had once been called, it became known throughout Persia and its client kingdoms as the place from which no name ever returned. The most famous prisoner held there was Shaqiu, the Arsacid king of Armenia, who ruled his kingdom as a client of Rome from 350 AD until 367. When the peace treaty between the Roman Emperor Jovian and the Sasanian Shah, Shapur II, ceded Armenia to Persian influence, Arshak was lured into a negotiation and seized. Shapur had him brought to the Castle of Oblivion and locked away, forbidding anyone in Persia or Armenia to speak his name. The story preserved in the Buzandaran, and echoed almost identically by Procopius, is extraordinary. After some years of confinement, an old friend of Arshak's, an Armenian eunuch named Drastomat, who had held high office under Arshak's father, appealed to Shapur for permission to visit the imprisoned king for a single evening. Shapur, for reasons the sources do not explain, granted the request. Drastomat brought food and wine into the cell. He and Arshak reminisced about the days when Arshak had been a king, when Armenia had been free, when there had been horses and hunts and battles to fight. And in the middle of the meal, overwhelmed by the memory of what he had once been, Arshak seized Drastomat's knife and stabbed himself in the chest. Drastomat, watching his master die, then took the same knife and drove it into his own body. Both men bled out on the floor of a cell in a fortress whose name no one was allowed to speak. Whether the story is literally true or a later dramatization matters less than what it tells us about the meaning of the Castle of Oblivion in the Persian imagination. It was a place where kings could be reduced to weeping over their own past. It was a place where the only human contact a prisoner might have was the man who would witness his suicide. And it was a place whose location was so carefully obscured that modern excavations near Susa, though they have uncovered chambers matching some ancient descriptions, still cannot say with certainty where Arshak II died. He was forgotten so successfully that we cannot even find his cell. Kavad I, the Sasanian king, who reigned in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, was briefly imprisoned in the same fortress after being deposed by his own nobility in 496 AD. He escaped with the help of his wife and a sympathetic guard, and later reclaimed his throne. His escape is one of the very few documented cases of a prisoner leaving the Castle of Oblivion alive. And even Kavad, when he ruled again, kept the fortress operational. Because every king in every dynasty needed a place to send the men he could not afford to kill and could not afford to remember. Number 4 takes us to the Chinese court again, though this time we are not in a hunting lodge, but in a specialized state institution whose euphemistic name concealed one of the most excruciating punishments ever devised. The Han Dynasty called it the Silkworm Chamber. In Chinese, Hanqi. The name was borrowed from the sealed heated rooms used to raise silkworms, where the delicate insects required warm, still air and protection from drafts in order to spin their cocoons. The Silkworm Chamber that received human beings was similarly warm and sealed, but the cocoons being spun inside it were not silk. They were the bodies of men trying to survive the aftermath of castration. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BC to 220 AD, inherited from the earlier Qin an elaborate system of legal punishments: death by dismemberment, death by boiling, death by being cut in two at the waist, and occupying a peculiar middle rank in the hierarchy of horrors, the punishment known as gongxing, palace punishment, which meant castration. Castration was not usually a death sentence in itself. It was a commutation, a mercy offered to men who had been condemned to die, but who for reasons of birth or utility were considered worth preserving. The catch was that the surgical technology of the Han Dynasty was crude. The procedure involved the complete removal of both the penis and testicles with a single downward stroke of a curved blade. The wounds were then sealed with hot ash or oil, without antibiotics, without sterile technique, without any real understanding of infection. The survival rate was somewhere between grim and negligible. And this is where the Silkworm Chamber entered the picture. Han medical practitioners had discovered, through generations of observation, that men who underwent castration were most likely to survive if they were kept in warm, still, humid conditions during the first weeks of healing. Cold air, called wind in the medical texts, was believed to enter the wound and kill the patient. So the state built specialized rooms heated with braziers, sealed against drafts in which the castrated men were placed to recover. These rooms became prisons in their own right. Men entered them alive, bleeding and screaming, and did not leave for weeks, sometimes months, and in many cases, never at all. The mortality rate in the Silkworm chambers is estimated by modern historians to have been extremely high, though exact figures are impossible to establish because the state deliberately did not record deaths in these facilities. The men who died in the Silkworm chamber were, in a bureaucratic sense, already dead. They had been condemned to execution and then had their sentences commuted to castration. If they survived the procedure, they entered the ranks of court eunuchs, palace slaves, or state functionaries. If they did not survive, they were simply the residue of a punishment that had, in its way, worked. And here is the twist that has made the Silkworm Chamber one of the most infamous punishments in Chinese history. The most famous man ever to enter, one, was not a criminal, he was a historian. In 99 BC, the imperial court of Emperor Wu of Han condemned a general named Li Ling to death for surrendering to the Xiongnu after his cavalry force was surrounded and destroyed in a battle he could not have won. At court, when the emperor demanded that his ministers denounce Li Ling, only one man spoke in his defense. His name was Sima Qian, the grand historian of the Han court, then 47 years old, and engaged in the compilation of what would become the records of the grand historian, the founding work of Chinese historical writing. Sima Qian argued that Li Ling had fought bravely, had been abandoned by his superiors, and deserved understanding rather than condemnation. The emperor, enraged that anyone would defend a general who had failed him, ordered Sima Qian imprisoned on a charge of defaming the throne. The punishment was death. Sima Qian was offered the two standard commutations. He could pay a ransom of 500,000 coins, an impossible sum for a man of his modest salary, or he could accept castration. To choose castration was, in Han moral logic, worse than death. It was to accept permanent shame, exclusion from ancestral rights, and the extinction of one's family line. Every honorable man was expected to choose death. Sima Qian chose the Silkworm Chamber. He wrote later, in a letter to his friend Renan, that has survived for 2,000 years, that he chose it because his father had commanded him on his deathbed to complete the records of the grand historian, and he could not do that from beyond the grave. So he entered the sealed, heated room in 99 BC. endured the surgery, endured the weeks of feverish recovery, endured the humiliation and the isolation, and came out the other side. He completed the records. He wrote 130 chapters covering nearly 3,000 years of Chinese history. He shaped the entire tradition of East Asian historiography. And every character he wrote was an act of defiance against the Silkworm chamber that had almost swallowed him. Most men who entered that chamber were not so fortunate. They died anonymously in a room that officially did not exist. Their names are not preserved. Their bodies were disposed of by the state. And the Silkworm chamber continued to operate under different names and slightly modified procedures for most of the next 1,700 years of Chinese imperial history. Number 3 returns us to the eastern desert of Egypt, to a series of stone quarries and gold mines strung along a dry riverbed that the ancient Egyptians called Rohenu, and that we today call Wadi Hammamat. If you fly over this landscape now, you see nothing but rock. Black basalt cliffs rising from beige sand, a narrow snake of a road, following the ancient Wadi running roughly 194 kilometers between the Nile at Kina and the Red Sea at Al-Qusayr. It is one of the hottest, driest, most inhospitable places on the planet. And for close to 3,000 years it was, where the Egyptian state disposed of the human beings it wanted to be rid of, but could not simply execute. The Egyptians called the fine gray-green stone quarried at Wadi Hammamat by the name Bekhan. It was prized for sarcophagi, statues, and small architectural pieces. From the Old Kingdom onward, expeditions were sent into the desert to extract it. The inscriptions those expeditions left on the cliffs of the Wadi are among the most abundant collections of ancient graffiti anywhere in the world. Hundreds of them. Careful hieroglyphic and hieratic accounts of pharaohs, viziers, expedition leaders, and the numbers of men they brought with them. Ramesses IV's great expedition of 1155 BC is recorded to have involved 8,368 men. Of those, the inscription states with almost casual honesty, 900 died during the expedition. Ramesses IV did not bother to explain why. He did not need to. Everyone reading the inscription understood what a mining expedition to Wadi Hammamat meant. It meant temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius. It meant water rationed to whatever could be carried in on donkeys. It meant work with copper chisels on stone harder than iron in the direct blast of the sun, from dawn until darkness. The Greek historian Agatharchides of Kaiadas, writing in the 2nd century BC, left the most detailed description of Egyptian mining conditions that has survived from antiquity. His account is preserved in the Library of History of Diodorus Siculus, and it is one of the most harrowing documents to come out of the ancient world. Agatharchides describes the condemned men working in the gold mines of the eastern desert as a great multitude, all with their feet bound in shackles, laboring day and night without rest. Recent archaeology has confirmed his account in an almost unbearable way. In 2023, a French archaeological mission excavating the Ptolemaic era mine at Goza, in the same desert region, uncovered a set of iron shackles designed to close around a human ankle. The shackles were 2,200 years old. They matched Agatharchides' description exactly. They could not be removed without the assistance of a smith. And they were found in a worker's room, dropped where they had been used. The men who wore them, according to the ancient sources, were condemned criminals, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and, most disturbingly, the entire families of the condemned. Diodorus records that Egyptian kings would sometimes send not only the guilty man, but all of his relatives, wives, children, aging parents into the mines. The economic logic was efficient. Each body extracted so much gold before it collapsed. The bodies were replaceable, the gold was not. What happened to the men and women who worked in these mines is not preserved in any personal narrative. They did not leave letters, they did not carve inscriptions. Almost all of what we know about them comes from Agatharchides, from the archaeology, and from the terrifying absence in the state records. Entire work gangs sent to the desert simply disappear between expedition reports. One inscription records the arrival of 200 men to work a particular vein. The next inscription, some months later, does not mention them at all. There are no death notices. There are no reports of accidents. There is only silence, the same silence that hung over the Sasanian castle of Oblivion 1,500 years later. The men had been sent into the desert. That was the end of the record. Whether they died of thirst, of exhaustion, of dysentery, of rockfall in the shafts, of the beatings of their overseers, or simply of despair in the crushing heat, no one bothered to write it down. Their families in the Nile Valley were sometimes informed, sometimes not. The state had received its labor, the gold flowed toward the pharaoh, the men flowed toward the sand. And when modern archaeologists sift the debris of the Wadi Hammamat camps and the Goza mines, they occasionally find a human tooth, a fragment of finger bone, an iron ring that once held an ankle, and nothing more. This is what forgetting looks like when a state industrializes it. Number 2 takes us back to the Greek world to a limestone quarry outside a city that had just achieved the greatest military victory in its history, and to what may be the single most concentrated act of forgetting in the ancient historical record. In the summer of 413 BC, after 2 years of siege warfare and naval maneuvering that had drained both cities of blood and treasure, the Athenian expeditionary force sent to conquer Sicily was destroyed by the Syracusans and their Spartan advisor, Gylippus. The Athenians had come with more than 40,000 men in the first wave, reinforced later by another 30,000. What was left after the destruction of the fleet in the Great Harbor and the massacre of the retreating army along the Asinaros River was approximately 7,000 prisoners. The Syracusans did not know what to do with them. They had not planned for such a number of captives. They did not have the food to feed them. They did not have the guards to secure them. They did not have the political will to release them. And so they made a decision that Thucydides, writing his history of the war a decade later, described in terms that still shake the reader 2,400 years later. The Syracusans drove the prisoners into the limestone quarries just outside the city walls. The quarries, called the Latomiae, were vast open pits gouged out of the pale rock over generations of construction. Their walls were sheer and 30 meters high in places. Their floors were flat, exposed to the sky, and impossible to escape from without ladders or ropes. There were no roofs. There was no shelter. There was no sanitation. The prisoners were dumped into the quarries and left there. Thucydides describes what happened next in a passage of such controlled horror that ancient historians have argued for centuries about whether he was writing history or literature. It hardly matters. The rations given to the prisoners, he tells us, amounted to a pint of grain and a half pint of water per day. In the September and October sun of Sicily, this was not enough to sustain life. The days were still hot, blazing hot, and the men had no shade. The nights in the exposed stone bowls of the quarries dropped into a chill that penetrated the thin summer tunics the men still wore. Sickness broke out within days. Dysentery, fever, pneumonia, the wounded, and there were many wounded from the final battles, could not be treated. Their injuries festered in the heat, and because there was no way to remove the dead from the quarries, the corpses simply piled up where they fell. Thucydides describes prisoners forced to defecate, eat, sleep, and die in the same square meter of stone, surrounded by rotting bodies whose smell, he says, was intolerable. This continued for 70 days. 10 weeks, in which 7,000 men were slowly reduced to a fraction of that number by starvation, thirst, sunstroke, disease, and the simple horror of being unable to escape from the dead. At the end of the 70 days, the Syracusans separated the prisoners by nationality. The men from the Athenian allies, from the Italian colonies, and from Sicily itself were sold as slaves. The Athenians themselves, along with any of their allies specifically identifiable as such, were kept in the quarries. They were kept there for another 8 months. Thucydides is careful with his numbers here. He does not tell us exactly how many men were still alive after the initial 70 days. He does not tell us how many made it through the following 8 months. He tells us only that at the end, some were finally allowed to be sold, and a very small number escaped and made their way back to Athens to tell what had happened. And there is one detail Thucydides preserves that has made the Latomiae of Syracuse strangely famous in a different way than most sites of ancient horror. Plutarch, writing centuries later, claimed that some of the Athenian prisoners saved themselves by reciting the plays of Euripides. The Syracusans, who loved Athenian tragedy but had limited access to it, were said to have offered food, water, and eventually freedom to prisoners who could recite substantial passages of Euripidean verse from memory. Whether this is literally true or a Plutarchian embellishment, it captures something essential about what the quarries did to the men trapped in them. Those who had been forgotten by their own city, forgotten by their commanders, forgotten by the political system that had sent them to Sicily to die, could still be remembered, individually, if they could produce something the Syracusans considered valuable. A verse, a phrase, a line from the Bacchae. Everything else was reduced to bones in the sun. The Latomiae still exist. You can walk into them in Syracuse today. Lemon trees have been planted in their floors. Capuchin friars used them as gardens after 1582. Tourists wander through them and photograph the sheer walls and the strange acoustic properties of the ear-shaped cave at one end. And if you stand very still, and if you know what happened there, you can almost hear 7,000 men trying to remember a play, so they will not be forgotten. Number 1 has no fixed location on any map. It is not a building, or a fortress, or a chasm, or a mine. It is a category, and the category is the ancient world's most complete engineering of Oblivion, a 55-meter chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus in Sparta, called Kaiadas. The Spartans did not build Kaiadas. Kaiadas was a natural fissure, a great vertical crack in the limestone bones of the mountain formed by geological processes millions of years before the first Dorian settler pitched his tent in the Eurotas Valley. But the Spartans found it, and they understood immediately what it was for. Kaiadas was the void that would receive whatever Sparta wished to be rid of, and Sparta wished to be rid of a great deal. Ancient sources are consistent on this point. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD, but drawing on much older traditions, describes Kaiadas as the place where the Spartans threw their most hated enemies, their traitors, their prisoners of war, and, according to a tradition preserved by Plutarch, though disputed by modern scholarship, their newborns considered too weak or malformed to be raised as Spartans. Strabo calls it, laconically, the binding cave of the Lacedaemonians. Thucydides describes the Spartans intercepting a pair of Athenian envoys during the Peloponnesian War and without trial, throwing them into a chasm on Mount Taygetus. The chasm is approximately 55 meters deep at its greatest measurable depth, though the true bottom has been obscured by rockfall and earthquake debris over the millennia. The most significant seismic event to affect the site was the earthquake of 464 BC, which killed thousands of Spartans in the city itself and caused massive collapses on the slopes of Taygetus. Anything thrown into Kaiadas before that earthquake now lies beneath a layer of boulders. Anything thrown in afterward lies on top of the boulders, and what modern excavations have found, beginning with the first systematic archaeological survey in 1983 and continuing through explorations in the early 21st century, is a bone field. Hundreds of skeletons, most of them belonging to adult males. Many of them showing weapon wounds, arrow tips embedded in ribs, spear points lodged in vertebrae, blade cuts on skulls. The archaeological evidence has significantly complicated the ancient claim that Kaiadas was primarily used for disposing of infants. There are almost no infant remains in the layers that have been examined. What Kaiadas mostly received, based on the physical evidence, was grown men, prisoners of war, traitors, enemies, human beings who had, in the eyes of the Spartan state, forfeited any right to a burial, any right to a memorial, any right to be spoken of as if they had ever existed. Being thrown into Kaiadas was worse than being executed. Execution in the Greek world was the beginning of a process. The body was retrieved, the family mourned, the rites were performed, the soul crossed the river Styx and went to its rest. A man executed in Athens by hemlock could still be a man, even in death. A man thrown into Kaiadas ceased to be a man. His body was not retrieved, his name was not spoken, his family did not know where he had died or when. He was simply gone. Ancient tradition preserves a handful of specific cases. Aristomenes, the legendary hero of the Second Messenian War, was said to have been thrown into Kaiadas along with 50 of his captured Messenian warriors after a Spartan victory. In the legend, Aristomenes alone survived the fall, sustained by his hero strength, and was carried out on the back of a fox that had wandered into the pit to feed on the bodies. The legend is obviously mythical, but the underlying reality is not. 50 Messenians did die at the bottom of Kaiadas, and their names were not preserved because the Spartans did not consider their names worth preserving. What archaeologists have found at the bottom of the chasm, in the more recent excavations is even more disquieting than the ancient literary tradition. In addition to the skeletons of executed adult men, there are pottery fragments, dropped items of personal use, and chillingly evidence that at least some of the victims did not die immediately from the fall. Some of the skeletons show signs of survival for a period of time after impact, indicated by partially healed fractures and by the position of remains suggesting movement before final death. These men, in other words, were still alive at the bottom of the pit for days, possibly weeks. They lay in darkness or in the shattered light filtering down from the opening 55 meters above, and they died slowly of their injuries, of thirst, of the cold, of the mountain nights, of the crushing weight of the corpses that had fallen before them and would fall on top of them. This was the ultimate Spartan punishment. Not death, not even torture, simply the absence of any further presence in the world. You were gone. Sparta had removed you. And Sparta, being Sparta, did not feel obligated to explain, apologize, or remember. Modern visitors can travel to Kaiadas today. There is a road, a small hotel nearby, that borrowed the chasm's name in a fenced overlook at the edge of the pit. If you stand at the overlook and look down, you see a dark opening in the rock, and if the light is right, you can make out the tops of boulders far below. You cannot see the bottom. It is too deep, too shadowed, too filled with the fallen debris of 25 centuries. But if you know the history, you know that the darkness you're looking into is not empty. It is full of men whose only crime was being on the losing side of a Spartan grudge, and whose punishment was to be so completely forgotten that even the archaeologist trying to remember them cannot always tell which layer of bones belongs to which century of atrocity. Kaiadas is the #1 entry on this list because it perfected what all the other prisons on this list were attempting. It made the disappearance of a human being into a simple physical fact. You dropped him into a hole, gravity did the rest. And Sparta went about its business, undisturbed, secure in the knowledge that no one would ever again have to think about the man at the bottom of the pit. These 10 places share a single, unsettling truth. None of them was a prison in the sense we would recognize. They were not built to reform, to punish, to detain temporarily, or even to hold a man for a proper execution. They were built to erase him. Some of them, like the Tullianum and the prison of Anemas, still stand and can be visited. Some of them, like the Silkworm chamber and the castle of Oblivion, exist now only in the pages of ancient historians whose descriptions we cannot fully verify. Some of them, like the Latomiae and Kaiadas, have given up their dead to modern archaeology, allowing us at last to count the bones the ancient world tried to hide. But all of them served the same purpose, and all of them relied on the same terrible technology: silence. Because a prisoner who cannot be seen, cannot be heard, cannot be visited, and cannot be spoken of is a prisoner who eventually stops existing in the minds of everyone who once knew him. His family stops mentioning him at meals, his friends stop asking, his name drops out of the tax rolls, out of the temple registers, out of the letters that circulate among his old associates. And when he finally dies, alone in his cell, or his quarry, or his mine, no one lights a lamp for him. No one whispers his name, no one remembers. Because the state has spent months or years or decades ensuring that no one is allowed to. The historical record has recovered some of these people. Vercingetorix, Jugurtha, Isaac II, Angelos, Sima Qian, Arshak II, King Wuling of Zhao. Their names have survived because they were once important enough that the effort to forget them could not entirely succeed. But behind every name that survived are dozens, hundreds, thousands of names that did not. The Athenian prisoners in the Syracuse quarries, whose bones lay unnamed beneath 8 months of accumulated corpses, the Nubians and Egyptians who died at Semna, and whose families were never told, the Spartan enemies at the bottom of Kaiadas, whose skeletons have been counted but not identified, the men who entered the Silkworm chamber and never emerged. This is the real horror of the ancient prisons where prisoners were left to die forgotten. Not the pain, not the darkness, not even the slow physical decay. The horror is the completeness of the erasure. To die is a human thing. To be unmade so thoroughly that even the historians of the following civilization cannot find your name is something else entirely. It is the ancient world's most efficient technology, and the fact that we are still discovering its victims 2,500 years later is the only reason we get to remember any of them at all. The story of one prisoner who refused to be forgotten waits in our next video on the Roman Emperor Valerian, who died in Persian captivity in the most gruesome fashion the ancient sources describe.